part of my college studies were in environmental education. Took me at one point to this marvelous residential study far away with 16 other people, just the 16 of us with our teachers for 5 months. And that setting threw me into a group with people who, some of whom were a year or more ahead of me in life experience and in their studies. And that could lead to some sharp differences in readiness for the world. I remember particularly an ecology conversation with a friend of mine named Matt. I was speaking about how a couple of symbiotic species that we were looking at might be relating to one another, right? It might be a parasitic symbiosis. You all know what that one means. One of the organisms benefits while the other is taken from. But I also knew from my schooling that they might have a mutualistic relationship. They might both be benefiting, or I said very confidently, it could be commensalism, where one of them is benefiting and the other there's no effect upon. And I remember how much I loved in that conversation the comprehensiveness, just recalling the comprehensiveness of those three categories of symbiosis, how they just summed up all the possibilities. Sure, said Matt, but the relationship could work in other ways too. No, I said. And I just remember how certain I was. I said no with this conviction in my voice and my body and my presence that just didn't give an inch, didn't give a millimeter for rebuttal. No, it has to be one of those three. And Matt let it go. And I won. I remember how certain I was that I was correct and that Matt was wrong. Matt was right. True life, reality, was a larger, richer thing than I was willing to be open to that day. Similarly, Jesus began to teach his disciples that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter, certain of himself, certain that God's hope must not journey down such a path. Peter, knowing that he had a comprehensive understanding of Messiah work, took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. As my friend Carolyn has said, I can't tell you how many times I have wanted God to be different than God is. Or to put it in a different frame, another friend of mine, she talks about when her successful husband lost his job and their friends in the neighborhood just pulled back from her family. Fearful to imagine that part of life, to see that possibility in life. So Jesus was taken aside by Peter, who began to rebuke him. But this was not a college argument that Jesus would let go. Jesus, turning from Peter and looking at his disciples, rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Jesus was right. True life and reality was bigger than Peter was willing to see that day. Jesus would be rejected. He would suffer and he would be killed. Jesus's rebuke is both intense and it is public. Notice how he turns to the disciples, and then he's going to turn to the whole crowd. He's going to bring them all into it too before he goes on explaining. And the intensity, I wondered, maybe it's partly Jesus doesn't want to be seduced himself by Peter's words. Get behind me, Satan. Satan is the vision of the seduction of the world, turning aside from the cross to Peter's way. But in the fact that Jesus turns to all the disciples, turns to the whole crowd, his intensity is clearly also for us disciples too. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. This passage is very often misunderstood. Jesus is not saying, as the church and other institutions have sometimes asked of us, Jesus is not saying that we need to give our oppressors a free pass, to bear voicelessly some ongoing evil, which often in the misguided teachings has led people to be subjected to ongoing domestic abuse, or to hang in there for a family problem that is not their calling to hang in there for, to bear an illness without seeking care. Jesus's whole ministry was about going out to people in specific scenes of embattled, voiceless isolation and releasing them. So that is not what Jesus is talking about. And in Jesus's call to take up our cross, Jesus is not saying, brandish your cross, brandish it, this sign of your Christian superiority. Anytime we find our hand wrapped around the cross and held up like this, we ought to take a real pause. Jesus did not wield the cross. What he did, very much in the sense of a vining plant, was to overgrow the cross. Or in the most poetic understanding of the marvelous fungi, Jesus passed through the cross until the power of the cross was just subsumed by his luminous passage through it. Jesus clarified what he did mean by taking up our cross when he said, in direct response, in direct relation to Peter's fear of death, those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake, for the sake of the good news, will save it. Jesus is saying of life, he's speaking again about the kingdom come, about living in heaven, in true life, in reality today. The kingdom of heaven is among you. Saved to Jesus of Nazareth meant saved in heaven today, much more than going away to be saved in away heaven after you die. In today's hard, intense teaching, Jesus shouts for himself and for us that life alive is one that is woven richly and fully into reality, such that we have no fantasy shortcut around the deep and unavoidable hurt in the world. Jesus passed through the cross not because he determined that he was a sinner and that he needed to bear this punishment. That's the misguided teaching. Jesus, we heard Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane cry out, Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. But instead, and this brings us right into the universal meaning of Jesus's crucifixion, of his self-giving on the cross. Instead, Jesus passed through the cross because he was personally and entirely woven into the washing of God's goodness over the earth, and eventually such a universal wave of goodness. It's going to wash up over the cold evils of the world. Those evils that are beyond the power of any of us to avoid. That is the cross. Jesus could no more avoid the cross of selfish, subjugating, strip-mining imperial Rome than you or I can avoid poverty or war or racism or ecological devastation. Show me how you can live God's way of love without washing eventually upon the jagged edges of these long-suffered evils of our world. And I will show you a world in which Jesus did not need to go to the cross. A Peter world. But Jesus was very clear. You cannot show me that world. Jesus did, however, address Peter's fear. He did address the fear and the difficulty that all the disciples in the room were going to have with this way. He did address the fear that the whole crowd, including you and I, are going to have living the Jesus way in this world. He went first. Jesus went first. The psalmist wrote, "My soul is cast down within me. Therefore I remember you. From the land of Jordan and of Hermon and Mount Mizar, from all the worldly places that I am cast into trouble, I remember you. Deep calls to deep at the thunder of your cataracts. All your waves and your billows have gone over me. Deep calls to deep." Jesus has gone first into the depths of true life. Jesus has gone before us in courage, in a vining mycelial triumph over the depth of the washings of love through a world that has hurt. And Jesus will be alongside us because deep speaks to deep. He has been alongside disciples all through the ages who have chosen to be alive to the fullness of true life. It is hard to look upon the cross, to feel its touch. But let us take it up and bring it along with us, and God will work upon it. As we pray in the Eucharistic prayer in Rite 1, which we prayed also these words in our spiritual communion prayer many of these past months. Let us present ourselves, our souls and bodies, as a living sacrifice, which God will see to and keep living, keep us living. Jesus was to be rejected and to suffer and to be killed. And then on the third day, also to rise again. And he would have Peter and the disciples and all the crowd come with him into the deep and into that way.